So now let's shift focus over to reverse T3 in stress. And as I mentioned, in acute stress, central secretion, central dysfunction inhibits TSH secretion, and you can get reduced thyroid output. And more importantly, perhaps in the periphery, you stop converting T4 to T3, which by an excessive reverse T3 and a deficiency of T3 will cause functional hypothyroidism. The changes can be prolonged, last a long time. And a low T3 to reverse T3 balance will give you a slow and very energy efficient metabolism, but the cost is of reduced function. So when functionally significant, this has been called in the past low T3 syndrome, which it wasn't, non-thyroidal illness, yeah, and euthyroid 6 syndrome, that just means the TSH is still normal, but they're sick. And on the ICU, they call it the non-thyroidal illness, but in ambulatory patients with a milder form, they can still have the endocrine dysfunction and chronic fatigue of people with chronic stress. And I like to call this type 2 hypothyroidism. I think that is a very appropriate name for the condition. This situation has really puzzled docs since the early 1970s because the patients really are functionally hypothyroid. They've got all the hallmarks of low thyroid, but frequently they have normal T3. That's why they had to stop calling it low T3 syndrome. They know their reverse T3 is disproportionately elevated, but unfortunately, due to Dr. Sirks's incorrect paper in 1973, common knowledge paid forward for all of these years says that reverse T3 has no function. And you guys know, I don't believe that's true. There are really a lot of misconceptions about this. I want to give you a quick history of the fallacies from the study of thyroid glands. Emil Kocher thought the thyroid gland was meaningless until he started taking out goiters in Switzerland and found that he had created post-surgical cretinism, acquired cretinism. And trying to recover from that, he won the first Nobel Prize. So you fuck up and you get rewarded for it. When it was discovered in 1952, T3 was assumed to be trivial because it was such a small part of the hormones that are contained and secreted from the thyroid gland. In fact, the paper saying it was important was actually withdrawn by 2 of the 3 authors in a big stink. And then it was republished later, and they said, oh, the retraction was incorrect. T4 was believed to be the most important thyroid hormone. I mean, after all, it was 90% of what's in there until Dr. Louis Braverman proved otherwise in 1970, studying patients who had no thyroid gland, they'd been surgically removed, and they were taking levothyroxine, and they had a bunch of T3 in their blood. Where did that come from? That's how we figured it out. And then Sirks said the conversion of T4 to either T3 or reverse T3 was a random process with no particular meaning. And people continue to say reverse T3 has no function. Here's reverse T3. It's the 3rd most common thyroid hormone. When the gland is stimulated, 90% of the hormone released is T4, 9% is T3, 0.9% is reverse T3, and then the weeest little bit of T2. And the biological activity of thyroid hormone is regulated primarily through its peripheral metabolism. 100% of T4 comes from the thyroid, but most RT3 and T3 do not directly come from the thyroid gland. They are derived from T4 by enzymatic alterations carried out in other tissues in the body. About 95% of circulating reverse T3 comes from T4 by the 5-deiodinase enzyme knocking off this iodine, right off the inner ring. Whereas 80% of T3 in the blood comes from T4 when a 5' deiodinase knocks off this iodine. And I don't know if you can imagine it in your head, but the allosteric conformation of these hormones is really, really different. So it's like bending your key and then trying to get it in the lock of the car. Won't start it. These steps occur in the cytoplasm of most cells through these deiodinase enzymes. There are three major types. Type 2 converts T4 to T3 for an increase in metabolism. It makes 50 to 70% of all our circulating T3. We'll come back to this very important enzyme later. Type 3 converts T4 into RT3 that has an inhibitory effect of downregulating thyroid function. And then type 1 is called type 1 because it was the first type to be discovered and it was the last type to be understood. It's a switch hitter, like Mickey Mantle. It can make either T3 or reverse T3 depending upon what's going on in the body. So misconceptions, reverse T3 has been said to have no biological activity because the earliest studies back in the 50s found that reverse T3 did not stimulate as they would have expected from thyroid hormone. But contemporary work also showed that reverse T3 could block the effects of T4. In these very early papers, I didn't notice that. I.J. Chopra did at UCLA. Even after T4 was revealed to be nothing much more than a pre-hormone, converting T4 to RT3 was still thought to be just a deactivation, just a way of getting rid of excess T4. But much more recently, Chopra's team has shown us that surplus T4 is adaptively removed by the so-called alternative pathways of conjugation, deamination, decarboxylation, and ether link cleavage. Secondly, we now know the conversion of T4 to either T3 for energy or reverse T3 to de-energize us. It's regulated, and it's regulated by many chemical mediators in the body. Evidence is now supporting Chopra's 1974 opinion that reverse T3 is an anti-thyroid hormone. So on the bottom line, the pre-hormone T4 is processed into either T3 or reverse T3. Each one is in itself a hormone, and they have opposing effects. And this is a lot like the way testosterone is converted either to DHT for muy macho or estradiol for más femenina. So, genomic effects of thyroid hormones. You guys remember the genomic effects from my neurosteroids lecture. Well, everybody agrees T3 goes into the cell nucleus. It binds to a nuclear receptor with which it forms a transcription complex that binds to DNA at its response element that activates DNA programs to increase our rate of metabolism. And it blocks all the DNA messages that slow the rate of metabolism. So Dr. de Groot in his endocrinology says thyroid is the thermostat of the metabolism. These genomic effects of T3 are its most important effects. But the genomic effect of reverse T3 was a big challenge. They tested reverse T3 by the same methods used to evaluate the effects of T3, and they got correct data, but they were misled by it. Reverse T3 does not stimulate. It has no potency when compared to T4, T3, even T2. Reverse T3 does not increase the patient's body temperature. Neither does it block the effect of TSH in enlarging the thyroid gland. It does not block the uptake of iodine by the thyroid gland, and reverse T3 does not keep the thyroid gland from releasing T4. And these are some very early, very simple studies even I could understand. But researchers incorrectly assumed that RT3 has little or no biological activity, which is still right out there on PubMed. However, the correct interpretation of these data is reverse T3 has little or no positive thyroid mimetic genomic activity because the researchers ignored the biological effect of antagonism or inhibition. And that's because in the early 60s, they had no idea of yin and yang of hormones, of counteracting hormones. It didn't occur to them. If I use the automotive metaphor, researchers studied the brake pedal, reverse T3, using every appropriate test for an accelerator. And when they found that the brake pedal in no way increased the speed of the vehicle, they declared it useless. You see, we now know that reverse T3 does have anti-thyroid effects. Reverse T3 is found to inhibit the action of thyroid hormone quite early on and from several groups, okay? And then later reports show there are some difficulties in designing these experiments and figuring out what they mean. We do know that reverse T3 cannot displace T3 from the thyroid receptor. And the reporters, particularly Smith in Australia, said, well, this is proof reverse T3 has not such good affinity to thyroid hormone, but to thyroid receptor, but that's incorrect. Smith went on to do the experiment the other way. He put reverse T3 on the thyroid receptor and then squished T3 in, and the T3 cannot displace reverse T3. This is the same as antihistamines, you guys. Antihistamines cannot displace histamine that's bound to the H1 receptor. That's why you have to take antihistamines for a couple of weeks before they work. Histamine cannot displace antihistamine from the histamine receptor. So the T3 and RT3 have exactly the same relationship to each other on the thyroid receptor that histamine and antihistamines have on the H1 receptor. So this is not unique in nature. The analogies, the homologies are obvious, okay? So reverse T3, yes, it has genomic effects. It blocks the thyroid receptor with an inactive hormone. And these findings have been confirmed, okay? And in 1991, they saw it again. And then in 2002, the vets say, look, reverse T3 is hypometabolic and it antagonizes the effects of T3. And then later in 2007, these guys thought they found something new. Woo-hoo! They said that reverse T3 may function as an inhibitor of T3 is an interesting new regulatory pathway in the cascade of signaling. Wow, wow. No, this is old news. It's been buried in the medical literature and nobody had the tolerance to read through all the crap like I did once one month when I had an unplanned sabbatical. Now, they gave dogs who were in hypovolemic shock. My old chairman of surgery, Dr. Polk, was really interested in this. They put dogs into hypovolemic shock and they infused them with reverse T3 and it killed them a lot. But when they gave them T3, they survived much better. So Dr. Polk had the first trauma center in the US. Now you know why he was interested in that, okay? So all of this, skeptics will still ask us, look, dog, is it even possible to block thyroid hormone function? To which it's proven, yes, absolutely. There's a thyroid hormone breakdown product called 3-monoiodothyronamine. This little dude right here, the acid group has been removed and it's been stripped of all but one of its iodine. And this has rapid anti-thyroid effects. You can pour this stuff in and put a mouse into heart failure quite quickly. And that's been studied by one of the best researchers, Professor Corley from Germany. So if patients with high reverse T3 have a low metabolism, are there people with low reverse T3? And do they have a high metabolism? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Patients with HIV develop low reverse T3 as their infection progresses. Who the hell knew? And these people have normal T3 with declining reverse T3 and is correlated with their weight loss. And in HIV, the study from Journal Nutrition, Primo's journal, HIV showed low RT3 and normal T3 are associated with a hypermetabolic state in AIDS patients with increased resting energy expenditure, increased protein breakdown, 22% greater protein synthesis. All of these are genomic actions of T3. So yes, the opposite is true. Furthermore, reverse T3 has many non-genomic roles. Remember, thyroid hormones have influence on cell functions in other ways. The receptors for these non-genomic effects include the integrin alpha V beta 3 on cell membrane surfaces. There are variants of the nuclear thyroid receptor that linger in the cytosol, because they're incomplete. They have different effects, which, hell, even I don't know what, I mean, I don't know what they're doing. I don't think even the researchers know all of what they're doing. And mitochondrial receptors and others are affected by these non-genomic actions. And many of these non-genomic receptors prefer binding T4 and reverse T3. They don't even give a damn about T3. That's for something else. These non-genomic effects alter the ion pump, sodium, calcium, protons, influence transporter-mediated entry of T4 and T3 into cells. Very important. They alter the effects of other signaling pathways in the adrenergic system, the metabolic sensing nuclear receptors, those PPARs we talked about a few weeks ago, and apolipoprotein E binding site. And there are still other non-genomic effects of reverse T3, some of which are actually opposed by T3. Cool. Now, this is fascinating to me. In the fetus, the balance of T3 and reverse T3 determines proliferation versus differentiation. They studied amphibian otic capsules, amphibian ophthalmic capsules, limb buds, tail buds, and when the capsules of the ears and the eyes and the limbs, when they are proliferating, there is really high reverse T3 and really low T3. And once they get to the correct number of cells, boom, the T3 increases and the reverse T3 goes away, and T3 sends them into maturation. Fascinating. Reverse T3 also directs the fetal development, the development of the fetal brain, and that also is opposed by RT3. So if normal RT3 directs fetal development, what does low reverse T3 do to malformations? And there are a couple of articles in the literature written from Frenchmen who state that Down syndrome children have significantly low reverse T3. Now, we all know they also have a lot of Hashimoto's disease in infancy and childhood. So something is up, and that something may be reverse T3, and the studies that were called for were never funded, as far as I can tell. Certainly, they were never published. Consistent with reverse T3 increasing proliferation, high reverse T3 is found in regions of wound healing. And high reverse T3 also increases the growth of some cancers. Cancer cells of which are undifferentiated, rapidly proliferating, and resembling embryonic or fetal cells. And cancer, like fetal tissue, is associated with high reverse T3 and low T3 in the peripheral circulation. And some tumors, especially neonatal hemangiomas and some lymphomas, can make so much reverse T3 they cause the child to have consumptive hypothyroidism. Holy crap, they're converting all its thyroid hormone to reverse T3, and the kids get hypothyroid because of that. So what if the enzymes that convert T4 to T3 don't work? Now, we know now that reverse T3 inhibits both 5' deiodinases that convert T4 to T3. Reverse T3 blocks the SOM counts. Reverse T3 blocks type 2 deiodinase, which makes 50 to 70% of the T3 that we use every day. Reverse T3 also blocks the switch hitting type 1 deiodinase, which produces up to 50% of the T3 that we use during the day. Reverse T3 also accelerates the degradation of the type 1 deiodinase enzyme. I'm going to skip all this text, okay? It's well referenced, I think. So we now know that too damn much reverse T3 looks like a bad thing to have. So how much is too much? It's generally agreed that euthyroid 6 syndrome is a big cause of more death on the ICU. The Karolinska Institute found that a reverse T3 value of 26.7 was a significant cutoff between who lives and who dies. They looked at myocardial infarction patients within the first week, and reverse T3 levels above 26.7, 10% of the patients died, but below 26.7, there were no deaths. So to me, that's a pretty significant cutoff level. The statistical significance was 0.0004. And the same elevated RT3 levels of greater than 26.7 were also predicted significantly increased death within 1 year. So it wasn't just in the first week, it was at the end of the year. This was Freiberg et al. In the American Journal of Medicine. So Robin Peters' group in the Netherlands said, well, okay, we know high reverse T3 is useful, but what about the ratio of total T3 to reverse T3? I keep carping about that to you guys. And I will again use the accounting metaphor. The pre-hormone T4 represents billing. So if you're not billing anything, you got a low T4, your practice is in trouble. But just having billing doesn't prove your practice is doing well. You look at T3 as collections. You want to have enough collections. You want to be in the normal range of collections for a practice your size. Reverse T3 is your expenses, your overhead expenses or business losses. And you certainly don't want to be high above the range of normal for expenses or losses. But the total T3 to reverse T3 ratio is what your accountant hands you when he gives you your profit loss statement. It's not just, okay, well, that's in the normal range for a practice and that's in the normal range for a practice. How do they relate to each other, my friend? So the T3 RT3 ratio is an essential measure of your body's health, not your corporation's financial health. So Peters studied this. He looked at 451 critically ill patients in his ICU, people staying there for more than 5 days, and 16% of them died. So this was a sick group of people. And he compared patients with values in the highest versus the lowest quartile. And the T3 RT3 ratio most strongly predicted life versus death with an odds ratio of survival almost three times. Whereas the RT3 alone is just a weak indicator, 0.3, 3/10 of the time, okay? So among the patients, the longer they lived, the total T3 ratios generally came up in time, but the T3 RT3 ratio increased only in those people who were going to survive. And it was unaltered or even got worse in those who died. So the T3 RT3 ratio eliminates a lot of common concerns in thyroid testing, particularly their non-Gaussian distribution and the vagaries of the 4 binding proteins that carry thyroid hormones, pregnancy, birth control pill, illness of all kinds, liver failure, by comparing the total values of both T3 and RT3, which have a very, very consistent binding constant. So the T4 that is not cleared by the alternative pathways, decarboxylation, deamination, ethylene cleavage, conjugation, will be deiodinated. And they'll go into either T3 or reverse T3. And so this writer in the best endocrine journal, well, maybe second best, says the total T3 to reverse T3 ratio is our best indicator of thyroid hormone signaling, and it is better than TSH, which astonishes a lot of our colleagues, but shouldn't astonish us by this time. So what is a normal T3-RT3 ratio? It's so damn important. What's normal? Well, thyroid hormones leave the gland or adenomas in a 10-to-1 ratio, as you've seen, 90% to 9% to 0.9%, 10-to-1. So any ratio greater than 10 indicates activation of T4 to T3. And a value less than 10 indicates the body is deactivating thyroid hormone to reduce the metabolism. There, I found 3 studies that measured the T3-RT3 ratio in healthy controls. Now, you notice I always put in total T3 because some people unfortunately compare free T3 to total reverse T3, which is comparing apples to baseball. Don't take a swing, okay? It's just not the same thing. And these 3 studies found their normal healthy controls, the ratio was between 11.3 and 12.5 with very narrow limits of variation. And in contrast, a study of unhealthy people with metabolic syndrome or the same problems except not quite the full definition, their T3-RT3 ratio was down less than 9 to 7.3. And I had found when I discovered this paper, I had the opinion my patients felt well when they got to the range of 10 to 14. And it's a little higher in teenagers, 16, maybe 18. So I think all of these things are consistent, that my 10 to 14 is clinically useful. So how do you diagnose dysfunctional deiodination? Well, your patient's got a bunch of symptoms of low thyroid. And on physical, you look for an abnormally indurated thyroid gland. You look for tenderness or persistent flushing over the gland. You do the 5 hormones on the lab test. You can test them at any time if they're taking no thyroid hormone, but if they're on thyroid hormone, you want to divide the dose evenly every 12 to maybe every 8 hours, give them 2 weeks to settle in, and then you test them exactly midway between their doses. Why do I divide my thyroid doses? Because nature gives us stable thyroid hormone levels. There's T4, there's free T3, as a 24-hour graph is damn near the same. Now, T3 has a short half-life, so it has to be dosed no less than every 12 hours. And that was known in 1975 when I was a sophomore at Tulane. It was in my pharmacological book. They knew it. They've known it for a long time. And you know what? Natural thyroid is better than levothyroxine because it has T3. So when you prescribe natural thyroid, you should give it at least every 12 hours. Sir William Osler, the best physician of the 20th century, gave it every 8 hours. Okay. Deiodinase enzymes make reverse T3 instead of T3 on a couple of big occasions. Number one, when T4 is high. Oh shit. So if I take once a day levothyroxine, what am I doing? I'm giving myself everything I need all at once, and I'm making my levels too high. And also when the ratio of T4 to TSH is high. So when you have a big blast of T4 with a once daily dose, it depresses your TSH. And now you've got high T4, low TSH. What are you going to do? You're going to make reverse T3, right? And every study I've ever seen that looked, and this is just some of them, have shown that once daily levothyroxine doses always give excessive reverse T3. Not sometime. Man or beast. That's humans and animals. So I've got our patient taking their dose every 12 hours. At what time should we draw the blood? Well, don't do it randomly because the free peak and trough variation is said to vary 30%. I can't find the reference for it. It wasn't proven. It's just an author's offhand comment. Internists, our colleagues, test at trough before the morning thyroid dose, which very sensitively detects insufficient treatment, but they can miss excessive dosing and do. In a famous study in a state fair, 25,000 plus healthy attendees, of all people taking thyroid hormone, 40% had out of range TSH values, 90% of which were low. So we're not doing that great a job with TSH, but testing randomly isn't that useful, okay? Now, some European endocrinologists, those followers of Thierry Eptour, draw blood at peak, which is 3 hours after the dose, which shows the highest hormone levels, and it will keep you from overdosing the patient, but it can be certainly expected to miss undertreated patients, and it does, okay? So at what time should the blood be drawn? Well, we don't have much of any pharmacokinetic information on thyroid hormone because it was all authorized before any of the tests were available. We had protein-bound iodine in the 60s, and Synthroid was okayed in 1957. So I test my patients' blood levels exactly midway between evenly spaced divided doses, which approximates the average blood level, as you can see from my graph. I had to take this from methadone because people giving methadone have thought about it, but nobody giving thyroid has published on it. It makes me crazy. All right. So if you test them about midway between doses, you're going to have about an average blood level. And it's repeatable and it's reliable. And when I showed it to the head, Dr. Scanzillo, the head of laboratory, he said, "Oh, you're controlling all the variables." Damn right, best I can. So whichever way you want to do it for your practice, do it the same way every time. Be consistent, okay? Don't just do it randomly because that's so embarrassing. So here's another patient. This should be patient 3. This was dysfunctional T4 deiodination. She's 31, has been hypothyroid for 14 years due to HASH. She was most unhappy with her levothyroxine 112 in the morning because in 2 years she had had 3 confirmed first trimester miscarriages and a 4th one, probably. Despite having a normal TSH and free T4, she had many symptoms of low thyroid. She was fatigued, cold hands, cold feet, tired on waking, gas and bloating, constipation, reduced libido, dry skin. Not really prime reproductive potential, I wouldn't think. She had adrenal symptoms. Her cycles seemed to be fine. She passed clots and had pain for a day. Her diet was gluten-free because her dad was celiac. She was slender. Her body mass index was 19.5. So I said, look, let's get you off the T4. I put her on cytosine AD. I divided her T4 dose to half a tablet every 12 hours and I drew blood. And this time, the TSH was low normal, free T4 high normal, free T3 around the 27th, 28th centile of normal, total T3 well down in the lowest quarter of normal, reverse T3 frankly high, and the T3R-T3 ratio sucked, 2.4. And would you anticipate that from her TSH and T4 that was done? I wouldn't have. So I said, look, let's replace some of that T4 with T3. And I used the semi-equivalency I recommend for you guys. 25 of T4 is roughly the same as 5 of T3, 5 to 1. Now, the NIH kind of likes 3 to 1, but I don't like that. 5 to 1 works for me for the most part. So these are the instructions. I have a blank and I type up the instructions because most of my patients are halfway brain dead. So I type out what you're now taking. And on week 1, I want you to do this. And week 2, you do this. And week 3, week 4. And after 2 weeks on T4 25 and 12.5, T3 10 and 10, she felt so much better. We drew blood 6 hours after that Q12 dose, and her TSH was virtually the same. So I like my 5 to 1 equivalency. Her free T4 was a skosh lower than I like. Free T3, upper end of normal, 2.0 to 4.4. Total T3 normal, reverse T3 normal, the T3R-T3 ratio 14.8. And very shortly after, I absolutely had to increase her T4 because she was pregnant. And she carried that pregnancy out and delivered this healthy little dude. And now she's had 2 healthy little dudes by restoring her T3R-T3 to normal and giving her a little adrenal glandular. Guys, that's all I had to do. These guys are now teenagers, by the way. I got to get an updated picture. I just talked to her last week or a couple weeks ago. So I do want you guys to see that this most recent T4 value is said to be low. It just doesn't bother me. I'm not worried by a free T4 value that's greater than 0.62, but said to be low. And the reason is that the reference intervals for free T3 are skewed high. I did a lot of looking into that years ago when the change from 0.61 to 0.82 was made, and it's basically crap, okay? I can't tell you what's wrong with their studies, but I can tell you clinically it's incorrect. But most importantly, her reverse T3 is well within the normal range. When you have a low reverse T3, that's a strong indicator of a physiologically low T4 because 95% of reverse T3 comes from T4. So if your T4 is really low, the reverse T3 is really going to be low. And when I maintain my free T4 at or above 0.6, the reverse T3 shall be maintained at 9 or higher. What do I think is absolutely low normal for reverse T3? Quest has it right at 8. I think 8.0 is normal, not lab course 9.2. But we'll move on. I do want you guys to remember and bear in mind that people do need some T4. It's a precursor of T3 and reverse T3, and it has multiple non-genomic functions. And studies, badly done studies, have shown that people taking T3 with immeasurably low T4 do badly. So these jerks said that proves that people should only take T4. What a bunch of crap. How much T4 does your patient need? Well, it depends on how much their gland can still make, okay? When a patient on T4 has a normal TSH, you can safely replace some of the T4 with T3. If you use that 5-to-1 equivalency, you make those small steps I showed you on the instructions that I gave to my patient to avoid getting a high free T3. And by the way, stop once the T4 dose falls to 70% of the total thyroid replacement. Once you get to 70%, don't go lower unless you've done this so many times you're absolutely sure this is the exception. Wait 2 weeks and then test your patient's blood levels. Now, if the result shows the RT3 is still low, then go ahead and make the adjustments that you need to fix it. Some women, some people need less T4 and more T3. Some people just need a little more T3. And my patient here is doing well. Last check, taking 74% T4, 26% T3. Which, by the way, is damn close to what natural thyroid gives. Natural thyroid is 80%, 20%. But that wouldn't work quite as well for this patient. So compared to a healthy human thyroid or natural thyroid, why should I give my patients so damn much T3? Well, number one, these patients have dysfunctional deadenation, so the normal rules don't apply to them. Duh, okay? And secondly, I personally believe the liver first pass has a big effect. And we have to accommodate for it by following clinical indicators. How do you feel? And blood values. What's your ratio? Now, patients with hypothyroidism type 2 cannot efficiently convert T4 to T3. And we certainly know that many hypothyroid people do not like being stuck only on Synthroid. And that's in the literature here. And we now know, thanks to Paniker, that up to 16% of human beings, Northern Europeans in England, do badly if they take only T4. And for those people, like this Nordic type here, it may be just stupid to put them on levothyroxine. And we now know from an incredibly important review that has been too much ignored that combined T4 and T3 treatment can indeed be superior. And this review, together with Paniker's 2009 paper, have finally allowed our colleagues in endocrinology to start treating with T4 and T3, thank God, so we don't stick out like a sore thumb. Now, those are hypothyroid patients. What about people with a normal TSH who have dysfunctional deiodination and a low T3-RT3 ratio from stress or whatever other reason? These are the type 2 hypothyroid patients. I think that's a good name for them. Is this really an issue, Big Al? Am I blowing this out my ass? Now look, if type 2 hypothyroid is real and euthyroid people simply can't activate T4, well, then T4 only treatment would not help some patients. And I've just shown you a bunch of references that prove this is true. Okay, Big Al, but if this occurred in people who were not hypothyroid, they're euthyroid, why, this concept could be lifted out of the critical care unit and applied to ambulatory patients. And you know what, guys? It has been. 2016, 2018. That's pretty updated. All right. But if dysfunctional deiodination causes clinical symptoms, we'd expect to see low total T3 and reverse T3 demonstrated in patients with otherwise unexplained thyroid symptoms like chronic fatigue. And yes, we do. Frontiers of Endocrinology, 2018. So we should expect to see symptoms in patients with conditions that cause dysfunctional deiodination, like euthyroid Hashimoto's. And man, we certainly do. So if that's true, Big Al, T3 replacement to bypass the dysfunctional T4 deiodination should restore a desirable T3-RT3 ratio. And that was proven by a brilliant guy in endocrinology of Japan in 1988. Absolutely dead hardcore proven to my satisfaction. Of course, I'm inclined to believe it. So if correcting the T3-RT3 ratio is beneficial, we ought to see reports claiming T3 treatment helps. And yes, we have. We've seen those reports in a wide variety of settings. We've looked at animal research on demyelinating diseases. We've looked at ADHD and hereditary resistance to thyroid hormone, Refitoff's syndrome. Yes, in thyroid. And we've seen it in depression. Give me an amen, Bruce. And we've seen it in dementia-related behavior problems and heart failure and toxin-induced euthyroid syndrome, including mycotoxins, thank you, Finland, and in people who simply have low metabolism that picks them up out of the gutter. Why does it work? Well, you have a stressed person. Stress blocks the production of T3, and it increases reverse T3. And you get a low T3-RT3 ratio, which makes you go slow. So there's your production of T4. And because of stress, you're not making much T3, you're making reverse T3. So key to understanding the treatment is this. 95% of that reverse T3 in your blood is derived from T4. Here's a reference, Chopra. So if I am going to give my patient prescription for T3, I'm going to get more T3 in the brain, and the brain says, dog, I don't need as much thyroid as I used to. So TSH is reduced, and the thyroid gland produces less T4, and the person with the jacked up deiodination can't make nearly as much reverse T3. So now I'm giving them T3, and they're getting less reverse T3, and I got them back in a good balance. I mean, guys, this isn't rocket science. It's simply taking advantage of a very simple feedback loop. And the one fact that the vast majority of reverse T3 comes from T4. So T3 only treatment has been accepted for use in particular circumstances by, this is in Groot's endocrinology. And it has been suggested by Groot for euthyroid 6. Treating humans with T3 in sub-suppressive doses, yes, it definitely leads to a reduced T4 and reduced reverse T3 in the blood. Endocrinology Japan, 1988. And since T3 therapy maintains or improves the T3 level, there's your proof, the T3-RT3 ratio can be increased. Now, we've long given natural thyroid to patients with clinical type 2 hypothyroidism who are doing badly on T4 treatment or who have chronic fatigue, autoimmune thyroiditis, or insulin resistance, and it usually works. But we so often have to suppress TSH in order to get it to work, and sometimes it doesn't work. I've certainly had those, and one of those patients was pissed at me, okay? The problem is that the 20% of T3 in natural thyroid may simply not be enough T3, and the 80% T4 may be simply too damn much T4 to get you back into a good T3-RT3 balance. So natural thyroid is better than Synthroid, but I've had scores of patients who just don't do as well as they should on natural thyroid. T3 in these patients is the one that works. I prescribe standard off-the-shelf tablets. And yeah, your patient needs to cut some pills, and no, some of them are little bitches and they shatter. So it's annoying. The half-life of T3 is something like 6 hours, and Q12H dosing works pretty well, and more of my patients are preferring every 8 hour to smooth out the peak and trough levels. I want you guys all to know, super important, the compounded slow release T3 is absolutely bogus. And I've tested a lot of patients, and I say this with absolute confidence, that when you test them and then you replace them with the regular T3 that doesn't have the micronized methyl cellulose in it, that you will find that half the dose gives exactly the same blood levels. The absorption is blocked by 50%. It is not delayed. That's not how it works. That was Dennis Wilson's great idea, and he never double checked it, I don't believe. Love Dennis. I owe everything to him, but that was a blind spot. So when you have a patient come in and they just bought a 90-day supply of slow release compound and you want them to take 5 micrograms less or more, what the hell are you going to do? They say, man, I just bought a 90-day supply. Can I wait? I say, yeah, you can wait. It's a pain. Sometimes the potency is variable, pharmacy to pharmacy, and some pharmacies are more expensive. And these days, with the cost of pharmaceuticals, a lot of compounded is less expensive. So I didn't expect that. Caution, when I talk to my patients before treatment, I always tell them that in my area, this is absolutely not the standard of medical care. So other doctors are going to give them at least a funny look. And some of them, frankly, bitch them out about me. You got to review with them the symptoms of excessive thyroid. And remember, the symptoms of low thyroid and high thyroid are often the same. So how do you tell? Well, as you build the dose, when you're going from a low dose, they feel bad, and you give more and more and more, they feel pretty good. But then if you give too much, they start feeling worse and worse and worse. And that's really important because I had a patient start feeling worse. They took more and more and more and more, and they just felt worse and worse and worse and worse because they hadn't listened to me. And you need to discuss problems with interacting stimulants, caffeine, decongestants, uh, stimulants. The problem is that a stimulant plus the thyroid, you get too damn wired. And I personally, my stimulant was caffeine. I was drinking 2 pots of coffee every day. And when I had my thyroid biopsy done and it was Hashimoto's, and that explained the rising TSH, I took natural thyroid, built up 15Q12, 30Q12, and at 30Q12, a pediatric dose. My hands were shaking so much I really had trouble putting in pressure equalizing tubes. And that's when I realized that because my thyroid was low, I needed a lot of caffeine. But then when my thyroid was no longer low, that caffeine was making me really shaky and I couldn't sleep at night. So I have these on those instructions that I give my patient. Cut your caffeine dose in half with your first dose of thyroid. And then as you take more and more, use less and less and finally get off the caffeine completely. Now, if you cut the caffeine in half and then get a withdrawal headache, which is no joke, I've had one, go ahead and take more, but only enough to get rid of the headache. And then, just continue to wean down your coffee because you're taking too much anyway if you get a caffeine withdrawal headache. My starting dose, if I'm giving somebody nothing but T3, is 2.5 micrograms every 12 for a week. Then most people can go to 5Q12 the second week, even little kids sometimes. And you build weekly as tolerated to a level that is safe. And if you haven't done this very much and you don't have a feel for what is safe, you can keep the dose at less than 0.13 micrograms per patient's pound per day, which is 0.06 microgram per kilogram if you're that European savvy. Do not give 0.5 micrograms per kilogram per day. That's been done, and it was way too much, and patients did badly. Very few women need more than 25 micrograms a day, and very few men need more than 30 micrograms a day. Yeah, I've got a few, not that often. And sometimes even much less is required. I had a patient who had sort of borderline Graves, and she just did so much better with 2.5 micrograms every morning. It just corrected that imbalance a little bit, and she felt much better. So I escalate the dose as tolerated. When a patient's taken a dose after a week, I ask her to just decide how she feels. I'm going to tell you, when you first start, the first 2 or 3 days, you can feel pretty weird. Your body's adapting to the change and it feels kind of bouncy. I've had a few people get scared and stop it on the second day. And I said, sorry, that was actually premature. If you want to, your blood test shows that that wasn't the thing to do that you needed. And if you feel like getting back on it, we can. And if you don't, it's okay. And they generally have. You don't try to hard sell people when they're a little bit freaked out. But at the end of a week, you decide on what you do next. If any increment feels worse, well, I ask them to contact me before they reduce the dose. I like to get a blood test to see why they feel worse, and then they reduce the dose. And then at the end of a week, we have the blood test results back, and we know how they do on the lower dose. And that's one of the reasons I know caffeine is so commonly a problem, because people don't quit taking their caffeine, even though I've given them all the talk about it. And so it's easy to say they were simply not getting enough thyroid hormone, but they felt overstimulated because they were, but just with caffeine. But I want to know about it. That follow-up is key. And so, we find out. But it's not often that we get a call like that. People rarely feel worse when they're first building up the T3. Most of my patients feel better with each step up, incrementally better. I say it's like climbing a ladder. Every time you go onto a higher step, you get a higher view. You're better, you're better, you're better. Ooh, after a while, you can really tell. Now, a few of my people are vending machine people. They don't feel better until you get exactly the right dose. So in a vending machine, if you want to get a pack of gum that costs 40 cents, you go to the machine, you got 40 cents in your pocket, you drop in the quarter, nothing happens. You drop in the dime, nothing happens. It's not until you drop in the last nickel, ka-chunk, you get your juicy fruit down. And people who have a different understanding or who are impatient, they put the quarter in and they don't get the result they want. They take the quarter out, they push in the dime, and that doesn't do it. And then they shove in the nickel, and they walk away with 40 cents in the pocket. They did everything, but they didn't do it all together. So you got to do it all together. And so some people, they just snap and they do well. And then some people, when they get that optimum dose, they feel a little bit weird, and then bam, they feel fantastic. That happens occasionally. I like to get my first follow-up visit at the end of the planned build-up time. So I say, when you start your last week of build-up, call me and we'll make an appointment for the end of that week. By design, I give my patient less than the estimated maximum dose. I would rather move them to a dose that I know is a little bit too little than a dose that I think would be risky too much. And the clinical response will guide the next steps. How are you doing? What symptoms have you got left? If the patient feels 100% well, just continue this dose, wait a couple of weeks for the levels to balance out, and then check blood levels midway between evenly timed doses. If you want to wait 4 weeks, you may. It's okay with me. Not a problem. If the therapeutic response is incomplete, well, are you worse in the afternoon just before the next dose is due? That suggests overtreatment, okay? Or are you clearly worse 2 or 3 hours after the dose? That suggests overtreatment. That's when the blood levels are highest. So you can ask some dumb questions, and if you really can't tell, it's always okay to stop where you're at and check blood levels. If you're in the Navy and you're in the middle of the ocean and there's nothing but water all around you, just get on your navigating equipment and figure out where the hell you are. That's a lab test, okay? So if symptoms persist and there is no question that you have over replaced, you can certainly continue building them up once a week, but I like to cut it down to just a half a tablet increase a week. So if patients on 10 and 10 micrograms Q12H, then you go to 12 and a half in the morning and 10. And then depending on how they feel, you might go to 12 and a half and 12 and a half, which by the way is a convenient size because you can break a 25 microgram tablet in half that way. But once you get to the estimated maximum dose and the patient's symptoms are not those of excessive levels, then you definitely want to get lab orders. And again, the short half-life makes the mid-dose testing even more important. And I see people who are overdosed because they were tested at trough before their morning dose, and people who were underdosed because they were tested at 3 hours, like the Belgians. And at mid dose, when I tested mid dose, I find that this picture here is ideal. Patients are happiest with a T3-RT3 ratio between 10 and 14. This ratio is 12. Their free T3 is around the 75th and 90th centile, right here. And the TSH and the free T4 are in the first quartile of normal. That's a patient who felt really well. Records keeping makes the treatment and your follow-up vastly easier. So when I get a lab report back, I have a little form that I have typed up and I send out to the patient with an email telling them about the results. And I say, just this, at the time of the test, you were taking how much T4, how much T3, or how much natural thyroid. I have one with 3 lines. And the blood was drawn X number of hours after your morning thyroid dose, and that morning thyroid dose was taken X number of hours after the previous PM dose. And then on my Excel spreadsheet, I have the blood is drawn at 10:51 in the morning, 6 hours after the morning dose, which was taken 12 hours after the previous dose. And this is what the patient was taking at the time, also taking a big dose of Vivel-Dot, by the way. And so when your patient feels well and the levels are good, then repeat the blood test at 6 months because things shift. If you're not sure and if things are iffy, check it at 3 months. There's no time you have to do it. If you're trying to suppress the goiter, you can give a slightly bigger dose and suppress TSH and check the test at 9 months. It's not mandatory, but what is mandatory is annual follow-ups. Once you have a patient on treatment and they're stable, you just really got to see them once a year and check blood levels. Now, our colleagues apparently want to keep their office revenues going, and they'll see patients every 6 months or even every 3 months. I find that unnecessary. So what happens during follow-up? What problems come up? And some of my patients don't make a follow-up visit or they skip the appointment, and that's never a good sign. And as I mentioned, some patients, very rarely, but they'll take more and more and more than you directed and end up taking a lot more thyroid than you think they should. So if the dose gets a little higher, it can feel kind of good. Some people like that wired, edgy energy, but it's risky. It's bad for their bones. It's bad for their heart. And then some patients just totally forget that dose response curve and they think that more is better and they just take more and more and more and more. So what I recommend is make the patient a timely follow-up appointment and hold the patient to keeping them. And most schedulers have a reminder. And by the way, I only prescribe enough tablets to allow for a few goofs, rescheduling for a few weeks, but never give a patient a year's supply of pills on the first visit. Just absolutely don't do it. 3 months is my maximum order. Because when a patient just pockets a prescription and doesn't show up for a year until they want it, man, I'm so tempted to be the soup Nazi. No thyroid for you. Now, why do some docs recommend this big, massive T3 dose of, 30 micrograms a day or 50 or 75? I've seen that in some dumb stuff online. It's because they're using this so-called slow release delayed resin in their compounded T3 slow release. And what it does is it blocks its absorption by 50%. So of course they're going to use these mega doses. And then they're not testing at mid-dose either, alas. What causes failure of T3 treatment? This is important. Well, people taking caffeine and other stimulants. I had a patient who was a speed freak, and it did, no, it was cocaine actually, and it did bad things for her. Insulin-resistant patients eating a bad diet. When you correct their T3-RT3, their blood sugar can go up, and what goes up must come down. So these people are now getting big spikes from high blood sugar to hypoglycemia into the 30s and 20s. So they're going to feel bad. It's because you've improved their metabolism and you've unleashed the normal blood response. And the adrenaline response to the low blood sugar is interpreted as too much thyroid. estrogen deficiency. Now we know that when you take a hypothyroid patient and put her on estrogen replacement, their thyroid hormone requirement can go up by 40%. That's true for pregnant women too. And basically, the opposite is also true. When you prescribe T3 to a woman who's either on estrogen replacement or is menopausal with no estrogen, then you will provoke their estrogen withdrawal symptoms. So your patient will say, "Oh, I'm taking too much thyroid. I can't sleep." Well, when's your dose of thyroid? Well, it's at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And when are you having insomnia? At 2 o'clock in the morning. Oh, sorry, that's not your thyroid. Are you really hyper? When do you take your morning dose? Oh, at 7 in the morning. Are you really hyper at 10? Oh no, I feel okay. So that's how you know it's not the thyroid, it's their estrogen. Or, feeling too hot, they'll interpret that as high T3 too. So talk to them. They may need some estrogen replacement, if they're willing and it's appropriate. And the plausible explanations for this is either the nuclear crosstalk, which a lot of people believe, or simply the thyroid increased metabolism will now more rapidly clear the estradiol, so the patient has even less. Another important cause of failure, and this sucks, is the fact that some generics are commonly contaminated with reverse T3. I've never had this happen with brand name Cytomel. I've very rarely had the question about the Sigma brand generic who used to make Cytomel, and I've never proven it. But Mylan and Perrigo and Tifa, there are some low rent generics. And why are they contaminated with reverse T3? Because the FDA is certain reverse T3 does nothing and they don't care if it's in there. And so a new startup company is not going to try to take out what they don't have to take out because everybody knows, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, reverse T3 does not. So when do you suspect this? Well, the patient taking the bad generic may feel better, but they're not well. And you get their free T4 down to less than 0.55, that's too damn low. But the T3-R-T3 ratio is still less than 10 and the reverse T3 is robust. So how do you prove it? Well, you just switch from the generic they're taking to Cytomel and you retest them. And what you'll find is the reverse T3 is much lower. The T3-R-T3 ratio is often a lot higher than 12. And generally, you need to add more T4 or take away some of the T3. Because of the reverse T3 contamination, you just gave them too damn much T3. Okay? You're driving with your parking brake on. And yes, brand name thyroid, Cytomel, and even Synthroid, they are better. And yes, one time I had a patient in South Carolina. It was not her T3, it was her levothyroxine generic that was contaminated. So it can happen. Only once in my experience. Now, sometimes a patient simply needs to have a low ratio of T3 to RT3 because remember that low ratio is adaptive in some bad circumstances. And two of my patients have been frankly unable to take any T3. Both of them were chronically fatigued with a low T3-RT3 ratio, and they probably had severe mitochondrial dysfunction. And I say that because they had had mitochondrial toxic treatments a lot. One of my patients was clinically free of metastatic colon cancer, but after he had had 3 courses of chemotherapy and a pneumonectomy as well as a colectomy. And I think some of his liver was carved out too. The other patient was taking 4 psychoactive medications, and when I thought to look them up, every one of them disrupted her mitochondrial function. And so by these people's intolerances of even 2.5 mics Q12 of T3, I totally believe the elevated reverse T3 was adaptive for their unfortunate situation. So how long do we need to treat people with T3? Well, I disagree with cycling people on and off, hoping that like a computer, they'll reboot. That's what Dennis Wilson suggested, and people following his protocol have done. What I find, if we can relieve or remove the causes of the excess RT3 production, we may stop the T3 treatment. And that includes autoimmune thyroiditis, 50% of whom remit. And the suppressive treatment may help that process, but I can't prove it. people with unstable blood sugar levels who manage their insulin resistant diet and lifestyle, and then people who are just totally stressed and anxious because of their crappy situation. Have them sleep enough, give them sleep aids if you really need to, exercise regularly, give them adrenal nutritional support and some proper counseling for their stress. So when you cover these bases after a couple of years, I'd say 3 years, talk to the patient about weaning down, but it's only as tolerated. Some patients can stop the T3 and do just fine. Others need some, just not as much. And then maybe another third, so it's about one third, one third, one third, and another third need just as much treatment as they needed before. So in summary, stress alters the adrenal and thyroid gland output. Stress alters the deiodination of thyroid hormones to create a low energy state. And these adaptive responses can become maladaptive with chronically prolonged stress response. And the resulting health problems are not detected by endocrine tests that are recommended in the standard guidelines. So the 5 most important adrenal points are that evidence supports the validity of adrenal fatigue. Adrenal fatigue can be diagnosed by metabolomics or other adaptations of standard tests, and it responds well to nutrient supplementation. Precursors bypass the stress-induced roadblocks in the synthetic pathways that block ACTH or block luteinizing hormone, and those precursors then can replenish the products. And finally, naltrexone can stimulate a depressed HPA axis to normalize cortisol production. And the 5 most important thyroid points are that reverse T3 is an active hormone, but it's an inhibitory hormone. Thyroid hormone doses must be divided at least every 12 hours, and many patients prefer every 8 hours, per Sir William Osler. Therapeutic blood levels should be tested according to peak and trough fluctuations. I prefer mid-dose. The ratio of total T3 to total reverse T3 is the single most accurate measure of the actual thyroid hormone function at the cell level in the body. And some people need to take T3 with or without T4 for their best clinical results. It is possible to achieve really remarkable results using these simple suggestions I've offered. So thank you, guys.